Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on most supported questions in the logical reasoning section. Most supported questions are about 8% of all logical reasoning questions, so it's a really common question type, one that if you can master is going to really help you both in logical reasoning and in reading comprehension. In today's lesson, we're going to cover the following: how to spot a most supported question, what's the process that you want to take when working on one, what are the common reasoning structures that will help you anticipate or pre-phrase the right answer, and the trap answer patterns that you can use to get rid of those tempting but wrong answer choices. So let's start by identifying most supported questions. This question asks, which one of the following is most strongly supported by the statements above? Well, we see the words most strongly supported, and we know this is a most supported question. Where this question stem? The information above provides the most support for which one of the following propositions? Well, again, we see most support telling us that this is a most supported question. In this question stem, which one of the following can be most reasonably inferred from the historian's statement? In this one, don't let the word inferred trick you. We're not looking for something that we know has to be true. We're looking for the thing that is most reasonably inferred. So again, this is going to be a most supported question, even though some people might mix it up for an inference question. The process that you want to take on a most supported question is identical to that you want to use on a must be true question or a must be false question. We're looking to find those related statements because we're looking to figure out what we know based off of what we just read. And the common term between the statements, the thing that makes them related, that is the connecting tool that we're going to use in order to draw out inferences. We can use reasoning structure to help us get a better sense for how the statements connect, and then use that in order to anticipate what an answer could sound like. Now, we won't always be able to anticipate the answer, or the answers that we do anticipate may not always be what's presented in the answer choices. But we do want to go through that process of looking for those connections between the statements and then using those connections in order to anticipate what an answer could sound like. Once we have an idea of what we're looking for, we can go into the answer choices and use trap answer patterns to make the eliminations. The most important reasoning structure on most supported questions is comparison. 58% of most supported questions use comparative reasoning within the statements. So let's take a look at this reasoning structure first. So here's an example question. Try this one on your own, hit pause, and when you're ready to look at this one together, hit play again. All right, welcome back. So we're looking for the claim that most logically completes the argument. And since the last statement involves thus, we know that we're looking for something that is inferable, or at least most strongly inferable from the given statements. In the beginning, we're told proponents of the electric car maintain that when the technical problems associated with its battery design are solved, such cars will be widely used and will result in the abatement of the environmental degradation caused by auto emissions. So what are they telling us here? The proponents of the electric car are basically telling us how good it's going to be. It's going to result in an abatement of the environmental degradation. Well, abatement is not necessarily a word we typically use. If you're fully caught up on your vocabulary, you'll know that it means to reduce. So what are they saying? They're saying it's going to reduce the environmental degradation or damage caused by auto emissions. So auto emissions are causing degradation or environmental degradation, and the electric car will result in a reduction of that degradation or damage. So this is going to mean, so we'll have less damage with the electric car than with cars before. Notice that the statement begins with proponents of the electric car maintain. That means that some people believe. Typically, when the author says what others believe, the author does so in order to challenge them. So the author's in a debate here with those proponents of the electric car, and the debate is either for or against the electric car. Now, there are proponents of the electric car who are advocating for its use, and then the author comes in and seems to undermine that view. Right? So we have a critic of those proponents, and the proponent of the electric car is saying that electric cars are emission-free. And then the author comes in and says, but unless we dam more rivers, the electricity to charge these batteries will come from nuclear or coal-fired power plants. So the critic is saying, hey, wait, just because the car is electric doesn't mean that the energy that it's using is clean, right? Because that energy has to come from somewhere. It may not be emitting emissions, but the electric car still needs to get its power from somewhere. And without damming rivers, we're going to have to get that electricity from nuclear or coal-fired power plants. So those are our options, essentially. Dams, nuclear power plants, and coal power plants. And then the critic says that each of these three power sources produces considerable environmental damage. So this is a relationship that essentially says that hydroelectric, nuclear, or coal-fired power plants, they all produce a considerable amount of environmental damage. So that's the concern from the critic, that the electric cars are going to require energy from somewhere, and that somewhere is going to imply significant or considerable environmental damage. Okay, so we have the proponents who are saying, hey, they're emission-free, and the critic who's saying, hey, yeah, but that electricity needs to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is going to also involve environmental damage. So let's anticipate what the answer might sound like. The critics are advocating against the proponents of the electric car. Well, what are the proponents of the electric car suggesting? They're suggesting that electric cars are going to result in an abatement of environmental degradation. Right? So there's going to be a reduction in environmental damage. And the critic is saying, hey, look, you're not considering the environmental damage caused by producing the energy for that battery in damming rivers or building nuclear power plants or coal-fired power plants. We have to get the energy from somewhere, and all three of those sources produce environmental damage. So what is the inference these statements are designed to lead to? Essentially, that the benefits of the electric car aren't going to be as great as the proponents suggest. Now let's take that and look in the answer choices for something that matches it. Answer choice A says that the electric car will have worse environmental consequences than its proponents may believe. Well, the words worse environmental consequences, we don't actually know that the environment is going to be worse off. But answer choice A is not saying that the environment will be worse off. It's saying that it'll be worse off than the proponents may believe, that the benefits won't be as great as they're suggesting. Well, they're suggesting that electric cars are going to result in an abatement of environmental degradation. It's going to a reduction in it. And the critic of the electric cars is suggesting, hey, look, there's going to be some environmental damage caused by the energy produced to fill the battery. So that simply means that the benefit of an emission-free car won't be as good as the proponents are suggesting, because there's going to be also that additional damage caused by the production of the energy. That doesn't necessarily mean that the environmental damage caused by the production of that energy in those power plants is more significant than the savings that we get from having emission-free vehicles. Nor does that mean that the benefits derived from having emission-free vehicles outweighs the damage that was done by producing that energy in power plants. So we know that there is going to be some savings. We know that there's going to be some costs. We don't know which one is greater. And A is saying that the benefits won't be as great as the proponents of the electric car may believe. This looks okay. So I might hold on to answer choice A and see what else we get. Answer choice B says that the electric car will probably remain less popular than other types of cars. Well, the popularity of the car is nowhere discussed within the statements. This might be something that you might come up with on your own and think down the road. Like, what happens if there are consequences to the environment that weren't being considered? It might turn out that leads to the car being less popular, but we can't support that with any of the statements here. So let's get rid of that for being out of scope. Answer choice C says that the electric car requires that purely technical problems be solved before it can succeed. If we look into the statements where it discusses technical problems, that idea of technical problems occurs within the proponents of the electric car's statements. The proponents of the electric cars maintain that when the technical problems associated with its battery design are solved, right, that word when is making technical problems a sufficient condition for the use of these cars to result in an abatement of environmental degradation. So that's saying that it's going to be the trigger, not the requirement. Whereas answer choice C says that the electric car requires that purely technical problems be solved before it can succeed. This is making the technical problems or the solution to those technical problems a necessary condition, as opposed to what the statements were suggesting, this was more like a sufficient condition. So answer choice C is reversing the logic of the proponent's claim. Answer choice D says that the electric car will increase the total level of emissions rather than reduce it. When the critic talks about the damage that's going to be done by producing this power in power plants, the critic doesn't suggest whether the damage is going to represent emissions or other kinds of damages. If we assume that that damage takes the form of emissions, which we probably shouldn't do, we still don't know what's going to happen to the total level of emissions. It might go up if the emissions caused by the production of that energy in the power plants is great, Or it may go down by a little less than we were hoping for if the damage caused by producing that power in the power plants is small. But we don't really know, nor do we know whether that environmental damage is actually taking the form of emissions. So either we can think of D as being too strong or possibly unsupported. Either way, it's not supported by the statements. Answer choice E says that the electric car will not produce a net reduction in environmental degradation. Now, this one could be very tempting. I can see why this one would look very good. But if you think about answer choices A and E, A says that the electric car will not have the same benefits that the proponents of the electric car maintain, whereas answer choice E says that there is going to be no net reduction in environmental degradation. Well, if the damage done by producing power in those power plants is less than the damage done by the emissions we'll be reducing from using electric cars, then there will still be a reduction in the environmental degradation. Right? We don't actually know that there's not going to be a net reduction. We just know that the reduction in environmental damage claimed by the proponents of electric cars won't be as great as they think it's going to be, because they also have to factor in the environmental damage produced by the power made in the power plants. So we may not have as much of a benefit, but that does not mean that we're not going to get a benefit at all. Answer choice E is simply too strong. So in this question, we do have more than just comparison. There's a causal relationship asserted by the proponents of the electric car that it will cause a reduction in environmental damage. There's a conditional relationship in that last premise that says that each of these three power sources produces considerable environmental damage. But the missing piece of information that will allow us to determine whether the critic or the proponents of the electric car are right is the relative size of the environmental damage caused by the emissions coming out of regular cars and the environmental damage caused by the power produced in power plants, depending upon which one is greater. But whether or not the proponents of the electric car are right depends on the environmental damage produced by the power plants. If that damage is greater than anything that we save or benefit from using emission-free vehicles, then the proponents are wrong. Whereas if it's less than the damage caused by those emissions, then the proponents are right. Let's look at another example, but with this one, it'll focus more on causation. Go ahead and give this one a try, hit pause, and when you're ready to discuss it together, hit play again. All right, welcome back. So what are we told? Well, we know that news media rarely cover local politics thoroughly, and local political business is usually conducted secretively. Okay, so we know those two things. Then it goes on to tell us that these factors each tend to isolate local politicians from their electorates. This is a separate statement. It's saying that those things cause politicians to be isolated. So we know those things are happening based off the first sentence, and we know that those things cause politicians to become isolated in the second sentence. And we're told that this has the effect of reducing the chance that any particular act of resident participation will elicit a positive official response. So when we isolate politicians, that causes a lower chance of a positive official response. And then finally, which in turn discourages resident participation in local politics. Well, what is which referring to? It's referring to what it just discussed, right? So that's lowering the chance of a positive official response causes or discourages resident participation in local politics. Right? So there's a chain reaction here. When media rarely cover local politics and when local politics are conducted secretively, that causes politicians to be isolated. And when politicians are isolated, that causes a lower chance that we're going to get a positive official response. And when you have a lower chance of a positive official response, that causes a reduction in resident participation. And we know that the triggers here are happening, that media rarely cover local politics and that local politics is conducted secretively. So what can we infer? Well, if we know that this causal chain exists and we know that the trigger of the causal chain is true, we might anticipate that the right answer would tell us that the end of the causal chain is also true. So we might anticipate that in this area, there's a lower chance of resident participation. But let's see what we get when we go to the choices. Answer choice A is saying that particular acts of resident participation would be likely to elicit a positive response from local politicians if those politicians were less isolated from their electorates. So if we put this into notation, we can see that it's saying that if we don't have isolated politicians, that will cause us to have a likely positive response. This one will be very tempting on the first pass, and it might take a second pass to notice the difference here. But there's a difference between saying that we'll have a lower chance of a positive official response and actually being likely to have a positive response. So it almost looks like answer choice A represents a negation of the relationship, which in causal language, that actually could work because if isolating politicians causes a lower chance of a positive response, then if we can remove that thing that's creating the lower chance, then we should have a higher chance of a positive official response. But having a higher chance of a positive official response is not the same as saying that we will likely have a positive response. So answer choice A is going just a little bit too far, and it's too strong. Answer choice B says that local political business should be conducted less secretively because this would avoid discouraging resident participation in local politics. Now, the key here is should be conducted. There's a recommendation in answer choice B, but that recommendation has no matching language in the statements. The statements are about what's happening, not about what should happen. And so answer choice B is simply out of scope. Answer choice C says that the most important factor influencing a resident's decision as to whether to participate in local politics is the chance that the participation will elicit a positive official response. And while we know that might be a factor, answer choice C, in going so far as saying that it's the most important factor, goes again way too far. It's too strong, and let's get rid of it. Answer choice D says that more frequent, thorough coverage of local politics would reduce at least one source of discouragement from resident participation in local politics. So more frequent, thorough coverage is the opposite of having rare coverage, right? They say that news media rarely cover local politics. So this is the opposite of that. And then if we're going to get rid of or reduce at least one source of discouragement, then we'll have less of this thing that's causing our politicians to become isolated. And if we have less isolated politicians, then we'll have more likelihood of a positive official response, then we're going to have more likelihood of resident participation. With causal language, we can't say that having less of the cause is going to mean that we're going to have less of the effect. We can't prove it 100% true, but we can say that it's supported. And so when we look at answer choice D, it's basically saying that if we have less of the cause, we're going to have less of the effect, which that actually follows given causal language. So let's hold on to answer choice D and take a look at answer choice E. It says that if resident participation in local politics were not discouraged, this would cause local politicians to be less isolated from their electorate. In this case, we have a relationship. If resident participation is not discouraged, well, where does it talk about discouraging resident participation? That's at the end of the causal chain. This would cause local politicians to be less isolated. And it almost looks like it's working through a contrapositive reasoning structure. If the statements in the stimulus were built on conditional logic, answer choice E would be a fairly decent choice. But it's deeper than conditional relationships. The statements in the stimulus are more about causal relationships. And the contrapositive does not work in causal language. So answer choice E is an unsupported relationship. We can get rid of it. And that leaves us with answer choice D as the right answer. All right, one more example. And this time we'll be focusing on conditional logic. About 29% of most supported questions contain conditional statements. Go ahead and give this one a try. And when you're ready to think it through together, hit play again. All right, so in this case, we know that nations are not literally persons. And furthermore, we know that nations have no moral rights. Next, we're told that no nation can survive unless many of its citizens attribute such rights and responsibilities to it. So the word unless is going to organize this sentence into an if-then relationship. And surviving, it says that no nation can survive unless. So you take what comes after unless, which is attributing such rights and responsibilities to the nation. That becomes the necessary condition. And then you negate the sufficient condition, and then we put survival on the left. So if a nation is going to survive, then it must be the case that people believe that it has rights and responsibilities. And then we're told, for nothing else could prompt people to make the sacrifices national citizenship demands. Well, nothing else could prompt people to make the sacrifices that national citizenship demands. If nothing else can do it, if nothing else could prompt people to make the sacrifices that national citizenship demands, then making those sacrifices, that has a demand. the demand is that people believe that nations have rights and responsibilities. So we have a couple of conditional relationships, both ending in the outcome that people believe that nations have rights and responsibilities. And we have a couple of statements before that nations are not literally persons and that they don't have moral rights and responsibilities. So where does this go? Well, we see that the latter statements are about what people believe, while an earlier statement is about what is the case, right? That nations are not persons, that nations do not have rights and responsibilities. But having rights and responsibilities is a necessary belief in order for a nation to survive, or in order for people to be willing to make sacrifices for that nation. So maybe there's a mismatch between what people need to believe and what is truly the case. Let's see what we get with the choices. Answer choice A says that a nation cannot continue to exist unless something other than the false belief that the nation has moral rights motivates its citizens to make sacrifices. So cannot continue to exist unless. So if it's going to continue to exist, then something other than the false belief that the nation has moral rights motivates its citizens to make sacrifices. Well, we don't necessarily need something else to do it. We just need them to believe that it's true. So if we put this into an if-then relationship, what comes after unless goes on the right side of the arrow. What comes before unless goes on the left side and gets negated. And we could express this as if the nation is going to survive or continue to exist, then something other than the false belief that the nation has moral rights motivates its citizens to make sacrifices. So it's got to be something else. But we know that in order for it to survive, it needs to have people who believe that the nation has rights and responsibilities. We don't necessarily know that there has to be something else motivating people. So this answer choice is simply unsupported. Let's look at answer choice B. It says that a nation cannot survive unless many of its citizens have some beliefs that are literally false. Well, again, with this one, we can use the word unless to create a conditional relationship. What comes after unless goes on the necessary side of the conditional. What comes before unless gets negated and put on the left side of the conditional, which means that if a nation is going to survive, then people need to have false beliefs. Well, we know from the statements that if a nation is going to survive, that people have to believe that a nation has rights and responsibilities. And we also know that no nation has rights and responsibilities, right? They have no moral rights or responsibilities. So if people believing that it's true, but it's not true, then we know that they're having false beliefs. And so, yeah, answer choice B does look like it's supported from the second statement and the third statement. Let's hold on to answer choice B and see what answer choice C gives us. Answer choice C says that a nation can never be a target of moral praise or blame. Well, the idea of being a target of moral praise or blame is not discussed in the statements. It's out of scope, and we can get rid of C fairly straightforward. Answer choice D says that a nation is not worth the sacrifices that its citizens make on its behalf. Well, saying that a nation is not worth something, the idea of worth is not discussed anywhere. So again, this is going to be out of scope. Answer choice E says that a nation should always be thought of in metaphorical rather than literal terms. Well, saying that something should be thought of in a certain way, like what should or should not be happening, is not discussed in the statements. So again, that word should is a tip that we're looking at something that's out of scope here. And that leaves us with answer choice B as the right answer. So when we think about what makes wrong answers wrong on most supported questions, right, there's issues of scope, logic, and degree. Answer choices that are bringing up new terms, things that were not discussed in the statements, are out of scope. About 21% of wrong answers are wrong because they're out of scope. Answer choices that build different kinds of relationships between terms that were presented in the statements. 21% of wrong answers are wrong on most supported questions because they're simply building an unsupported relationship. 17% of answer choices are wrong because they're contradicting the statements presented initially. 7% of wrong answers are wrong because they're either reversing or negating a relationship or an inference of those relationships. And then 33% of wrong answers are wrong because they're simply too strong. This is a really important one. When you get to most supported questions, pay attention to the degree and make sure that the answer choice you're looking at is not stronger than what is supported by the statements. So in summary, you spot a most supported question with language in the question stem, and you're looking for most supported or most reasonably inferred or provide the strongest support for. Language that will suggest that it's going to be the best of what's available, but not necessarily something you know 100% to be true. All three reasoning structures are present on most supported questions. 58% of them involve a comparative relationship, 37% of them involve a causal relationship, and 29% of them involve a conditional relationship, or some combination thereof. Trap answers that you really want to be on the lookout for on most supported questions include answer choices that are too strong, answer choices that are out of scope, answer choices that are building an unsupported relationship, answer choices that contradict the statements, and answers that either build a reversal or a negation between the terms that could be inferred. So that's it for today's lesson on most supported questions. I invite you to check out these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.